Alright, I'm in the countries controller, and let's create the action to create a country. And of course, we need to pass in the country object. So we'll do country object, and I'll name it country to create. Now we need to bring in the namespace for the object, which is in models folder. And now, as we already discussed, this method will simply use URI API/countries. So let's mark it. However, it will be a post, not a GET call. So we will mark it as HTTP post. Okay, so how do we actually pass the country object into this method? Think of it like the user enters the name of the country in a form and hits submit button. That submit button simply triggers a post request that will pass the information, in this case the name of the country. So our action in the controller grabs this object that at the moment only contains the name and passes it into the create country action. Country, of course, also has an ID, but we are not passing in the ID because this is a new country and the ID will be automatically created for us by the database. And then the country will be added to the DB context, and then we'll call the save method and make the changes to the database. So the country object comes from a form, or in other words, it will come from the body request. That's actually how we need to mark the country object argument to indicate that all the information comes from the body of the post request. So before we pass in the object country, we'll mark it as from body. And you can see that it specifies that the parameter or property should be bound using the request body. Alright, so we have the object to create. First, we need to make sure that the object is actually valid. So we check if the country to create is null, and if it is, we return bad request status. So that's a simple if statement, and we'll check if the country to create equals null, meaning that the user submitted empty form, for example. And if so, we will return bad request. And we can return the model state with it. Now if the country is not null, we need to make sure that the country with the same name doesn't already exist. Now to check if we are entering a duplicate country, you may be tempted to go to the country repository and call the isDuplicateCountry name. However, this will not work when we are creating a country, because at this time we do not have the country ID yet. This method only works for the update, when we are updating existing country with existing ID. However, what we can do is actually reuse this line. I'm gonna copy the whole thing, and in the countries controller, I'll paste it right there. So we are going to look for a country that has the same name as the country to create. Remember, this is an object of country, so there is a property of name. We won't worry about the ID, because if there is already a country with the same name as the country to create, then we are trying to enter a duplicate name for the country. Now, of course, I don't go to the context here. What I'm going to do is to the repository, and here I will call the get countries. So we don't go to the dataset or anything, but after we get all the countries, I'm going to use the where clause to only select the one that matches this country to create name. So I'll copy that and paste it here, and we have the property name. But let me put this on the next line. So we select all the countries, and then in the where clause we only select the country that matches the name of the country we're trying to enter. And hopefully there is none. Hopefully we are not trying to enter a duplicate. And we don't need the ID, so I'll delete that. but I'll leave the first or default. So once we find a country with the matching name, then yes, we are trying to enter a duplicate. And if that's the case, we can now do an if statement and return an error message informing the user that the user is trying to enter a duplicate name, that the country already exists. So we will do a simple if statement and check if the country is null or if it is not null. Because if it is not null, that means we found a duplicate country and we can add it to the model state as an error. So I will do a model state dot, and we can add errors using the add model error. This is a custom error message that I'm going to add to it. The first parameter is a key, but in our case we don't really care for it, so I'll just leave it empty. And I want to create a custom message name that simply says that the country name already exists. So here I will spell out the country name that the user is trying to enter and telling the user that it already exists. And now I will also return a status code, and there's different status codes you can use. You can, for example, use conflict, but in this case I'm going to use 422 status code, which means unprocessable entity. We cannot process this entity because it already exists. So we will do a return, and we will return a status code of 422. But with this case, I also want to actually return the model state. So for debugging, I will be able to see the custom error message as well as any other error that might be in the model state. So if we are entering a valid country, we can move on, and we still need to validate the model state because something else may have gone wrong. So we will do another if statement and do the final check for the model state. So this is the validation, and next we can actually create the country.